She was left at the train station like baggage no one claimed, but when the richest rancher stepped off in silence, the entire town's fate changed forever. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope enjoy the story. The train whistle pierced the dusty silence of the frontier morning like a broken cry, echoing through the dry blood-red canyons and empty plains that stretched toward forever. The platform at Dry Creek Station was no grand hall, just a slanted timber porch beside a sun-bleached signboard on that day. It bore witness to a silent unraveling. She stepped off the final car, wearing a dress that had once been ivory and now wore the earth like sorrow, the hem tattered from too many places she didn't belong. Her satchel was thin, her posture thinner, and her eyes carried more dust than water. She waited. For anyone, for anything, for a name to be but the air stayed dry and dumb, and the other passengers trickled into carriages, wagons, and outstretched arms that didn't reach for her. No one stepped forward. No letter came. And the conductor, after watching long enough to feel sorry, but not long enough to act, tipped his hat and climbed back aboard. The train pulled away in a slow, rattling retreat, and she was left behind. Like forgotten luggage, a dog barked in the distance. A vulture tilted in the sky. Behind her, the ticket master closed his ledger with a sigh, as though to say, "Another one." She sat on the bench that faced the tracks, where the metal rails shimmered in the heat like a promise already broken. The silence was louder now. It wasn't the kind that came from peace, but the kind that came when people knew you didn't matter anymore. People passed her, glanced, and looked away. That was the cruelest part, how practiced they were at ignoring girls like her. Someone even tossed a coin near her feet, as if she were an accident they wanted to atone for quickly. But she didn't pick it up. She didn't even flinch. She just stared down the horizon where the rails bent out of sight and waited for something to make sense again. That's when the second train came, slow and heavy with breath. It rolled in as if it had all the time in the world. Pulling behind it, not carriages, but questions. It wasn't scheduled. No whistle blew. The engine hissed like it was tired of hiding. And then he stepped off. He wore black, not the kind you wear to mourn, but the kind you wear to warn. Tall, broad, and wrapped in quiet, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. His boots hit the planks like hammers against the coffin. He didn't carry luggage, he didn't carry a smile. He carried history in his shoulders and something dangerous in his stillness. He looked once around the platform, slow and deliberate, like he wasn't searching, but remembering. Then, his eyes fell on her. She didn't rise. She didn't speak. But something in the air changed, like the prairie wind holding its breath. He said nothing. He just walked past the others, past the coin on the ground, and stood in front of her like a final chapter, waiting to be written, and still no words. Then, with a simple nod, he gestured toward the horizon, toward the dust, the plains, the unknown. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't a question. It was fate, and she followed. They didn't look back at the platform, but everyone else did, because somehow, everyone knew something had just shifted. Something that would rewrite everything Dry Creek thought it knew about redemption, about silence, and about who gets left behind. The girl had no idea where he was taking her, but her feet moved without resistance, stirred by something deeper than logic. The rancher walked ahead, not too fast, not too slow, like he was guiding something sacred. His silence wasn't empty, it held weight, like a story carved in stone, waiting to be read without ink. His boots pressed deep into the dust trail, leading out of Dry Creek, the same trail where outlaws once fled and preachers once wept. And she followed, because somehow her spirit recognized the rhythm of his steps. Even though her mind had not caught up, they reached a battered wagon tethered under the shadow of a gnarled cottonwood tree. Two black horses stood still like carved obsidian, unmoving even as cicadas screamed overhead. The rancher climbed up, said nothing, and waited. She took her place beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. The wagon groaned into motion. The landscape was barren but not dead, just tired. As the wheels turned, she passed broken fences, dry creek beds, and homes with more holes than walls. Every now and then, a pair of eyes peeked from windows, tracking the silent procession like it carried ghosts. She didn't ask questions, she didn't need to. The farther they went from the station, the more she felt the train leaving her bones. The more she felt something new arriving, though she didn't yet know what. After what felt like hours, the ranch came into view. It wasn't grand in the way eastern estates were. No marble, no towers. But it was wide, strong, and silent-like. The man beside her. A great wooden gate opened without a creak. Cattle roamed beyond fences that reached into the horizon. And workers paused at the sight of her like they'd seen an echo from a dream. They didn't dare explain. The main house was made of dark logs and pale stone, shaped like it was built to withstand every storm the west could throw at it. The porch held a rocking chair that hadn't rocked in years, and the air smelled of sun-warmed cedar and old fires. He helped her down, not gently, not roughly, just purposefully. Like she was meant to stand there. Inside, the air changed. Cool. Still, heavy with the scent of leather and old paper, she was led through hallways that whispered of a lifelong lived in silence. And then, a door opened, not to a guest room, not to a parlor, but to a library. It was vast. Books climbed the walls like vines, interrupted only by maps, portraits, and windows that stared out into forever. She stepped inside like she was stepping into another life. He pointed to a chair by the hearth. She sat. He left. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes dressed in long shadows. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. He placed it before her, gave one glance, and left the room again. Inside the box was a faded photograph of a woman who looked like a mirror warped by time. A letter written in a hand that matched the ache in her heart, and beneath them, a silver brooch shaped like a swallow in flight. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was meant for her. That night, she slept in a room that faced the east. She didn't ask why, but she woke up at dawn, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a forgotten suitcase on the wrong platform. Out there in the fields, the rancher stood alone at the edge of a pasture, watching the sunrise like it owed him an answer. And inside, the girl held the brooch, like it owed her a past. The days passed, like sand falling through an hourglass too heavy to lift. The girl began to learn the rhythms of the land, a creak of the windmill at dawn, the whistle of the kettle in the kitchen before the rooster crowed, and the way the rancher always disappeared just before sundown to stand near the edge of the orchard that stretched behind the ranch house like a memory. She was not spoken to, yet no one treated her as an intruder. The workers nodded respectfully when she passed. The cook left warm bread at her door each evening, and the ranch dogs sat beside her without command, as if they, too, had chosen her. She discovered that everything on the ranch moved with purpose, and that silence here was not neglected, was reverence. Every post in the fence had been hammered in like a prayer, every horse groomed like a relic. This place was built not just on land, but on loss. She wandered the orchard one morning, chasing the scent of ripening peaches and sunlight soaked into bark. That's when she saw it. A clearing with no trees, just scorched earth and a single wooden cross tilted with age. No name carved into it, no flowers, just silence so heavy it made the branches bow nearby. Something had burned here, not just the ground, but something deeper. A truth buried beneath ash and root. She stood there long enough for her shadow to stretch into the grave, and she realized this was why the rancher came here each evening. This was the place he spoke to when he said nothing. That night, when he did not return from the orchard at his usual hour, she followed the path alone. She found him kneeling, not praying, not weeping, just holding a burnt piece of wood in his hand, small and polished smooth with time. It looked like part of a child's toy, a wheel from a wagon, maybe. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence, but didn't need to. She knelt beside him. She didn't speak, and that's when the wind picked up. Not like a storm, but, like breath returning. She had always believed she was the only one carrying invisible weight. But in that orchard, she understood something sacred. This land was not quiet because it was empty. It was quiet because it was still listening. to grief. The next morning, the cook brought out a pair of riding boots. Not for the ranch hands. For her, there was work to do. Not as a guest, but as someone who was staying. She cleaned stables, fed animals, chopped wood, and the workers stopped treating her like someone passing through. She heard her name for the first time in weeks. Miss Ilara, one of them called. It sounded strange and whole. She found a rhythm here, one that didn't rush to explain itself. It was not kindness that kept her fed and clothed, it was something stronger, recognition. But one evening, a letter arrived, hand-delivered, sealed with a family crest. It bore the name of a man, she thought, had forgotten her, a man who once promised her the world, then abandoned her without explanation. Her half-brother. Inside was a single sentence. "Come back. Father is dead. You've inherited the estate." She read it 3 times. Her hands didn't tremble, but her heart did. Ilara wasn't left at the station by accident. She had been cast aside by people who believed she had no worth, and now they were calling her back, not out of guilt, but because of legacy. She held the brooch tightly that night, and for the first time, she wasn't sure whether it represented who she came from or what she had become. The rancher stood in the orchard again that dusk, and this time she did not follow. She stayed behind to watch him disappear into shadows, because now she had shadows of her own. The morning she left the ranch was not marked by farewells or blessings. The sky was overcast, the air thin with waiting. No one asked where she was going, but the ranch dogs whined at her heels and refused to leave the porch until the wagon was out of sight. She wore the brooch pinned tightly at her collar, not as a symbol of loyalty to the past, but as armor. It was not the same girl who had stepped off the train weeks ago. Ilara had changed, her back straighter, her voice steadier, her silence now full of decision, not desperation. The estate loomed like a mausoleum atop the hill, untouched by time but soured by it. As the carriage creaked through its iron gates, memories clawed at her like weeds. She remembered the parties where she wasn't allowed to speak, the dinners where she was served last, the way her stepmother's laughter always ended with a glance sharp enough to cut her soul. It had once been her home. Now it was her battlefield. The servants recognized her with surprise masked as discomfort. The halls, once echoing with foreign music and pride, now smelled of decay. Her father's portrait still hung above the staircase, eyes forever judging. But now there was no man in the chair, no booming voice in the office, no one to command or control, just silence that came not from peace but from rot. Her half-brother arrived late that evening, dressed like mourning, but smiling like victory. He kissed her hand as though he had not been the one to exile her. His words were soft, but every syllable reeked of calculation. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She watched him the way the desert watches a storm, unblinking. The reading of the will was held in the library, the same room where she'd once been told she didn't belong. Her name was mentioned once. Then, everything changed. The land, the cattle, the titles, the accounts, all hers. Her half-brother's face didn't break. It shattered. He challenged it immediately, but the papers were signed. The signatures were clear. The lawyer's firm, the inheritance was absolute, and Ilara sat at the head of the long oak table like a ghost who had returned not to haunt but to reclaim. But she didn't stay long. The estate, rich as it was, felt hollow, like a mansion made of painted dust. The staff treated her with stiff reverence. The villagers came with requests. The lawyers stayed close, but none of it felt real. She walked through the rose garden, and it bloomed just as falsely as before. She slept in her old room, and it felt colder than the barn on the ranch. She realized then this was not home. This was a graveyard of all the things she had once hoped for. A week later, she left again. No announcement, no carriage. She rode a single brown mare she had chosen from the stables herself, wearing boots crusted with ranch mud. She took only one thing with her, a deed to land on the edge of Dry Creek. The land the family had bought and forgotten. Land that bordered the ranch. Land she now owned. When she arrived at the gate of the ranch, the same one that once opened for her in silence, The rancher was already standing there. As if he had known. As if he had waited. He said nothing. But this time, she stepped down from the saddle, walked to him, and handed him the deed. He opened it slowly, read it, and then looked to her not with surprise, but with something closer. To respect. She had not returned to be rescued. She had returned to rebuild. Not just herself, but the land, the truth, and the silence between them. The sun rose behind the ranch like a judgment delayed. Elara stood at the boundary where her newly inherited land met the rancher's, a line drawn years ago in contracts and forgotten grudges. Now blurred by time and weather, she had returned, not just to reclaim land, but to restore dignity, purpose, and roots where there had once been only erasure. In the days that followed, she worked harder than any of the ranch hands. She didn't oversee, she bled beside them, hammered fences, cleared stones, learned to plow, ride, brand. The hands began calling her boss without sarcasm. The land long neglected began to breathe again under her care. Green crept back. Along the ridges, cattle found water where drought had claimed the creek. The rancher, ever silent, watched from afar. He didn't offer advice, didn't step in, but he came by more often. Sometimes with extra feed, sometimes with seeds, sometimes just standing beside her while the prairie wind tangled their shadows together. They still hadn't spoken, but silence had become their language. And in that unspoken rhythm, they built something larger than themselves. Then came the fire. It started on the fourth night of a dry lightning storm, far across the ridge, but the wind changed. The flames danced faster than fear, and by dawn, they were licking at the edge of her new fields. Elara didn't run. She rallied the workers, cut fire breaks, doused flames, and formed a line of buckets that stretched from the ranch well to the smoldering grass. The rancher arrived with his crew like thunder, silent but fierce. He rode straight into the smoke with no warning, and returned with one of her ranch hands slung across his saddle. Unconscious but breathing. They fought the fire together, woman, man, worker, earth. And when the final embers died beneath their boots, the land was blackened but not broken. She stood on her knees, covered in ash, her face streaked with tears and soot, and for the first time, the rancher knelt beside her, reached out, and placed his hat over her heart. It wasn't romantic, it was sacred. Because when a person gives you the only thing they've trusted to shield them for years, it means something, more than words ever could. In the weeks after, the land healed. The orchard bloomed again, and people began whispering stories at the local inn about the girl who returned from exile and tamed the land. About the rancher who stood beside her, not because she asked, but because she had proven herself worthy of being followed. They weren't just rebuilding territory. They were restoring legacy, one of mutual respect, of labor, of silence turned into something holy. And though Elara never told anyone what she planned to do next, she spent her evenings under the lone cottonwood with a stack of maps, a book of railroad records, and a piece of old rope she used to tie together deeds, titles, and soil samples. She wasn't expanding for power, she was anchoring her soul. And when the train passed through Dry Creek, one late afternoon, rare thing, it did not stop. But the conductor tipped his hat from the engine window as it roared by, because even he had heard that the girl left behind at the station was now the woman building a town, and she didn't need to board another train to find her future. She was planting it acre by acre, right where she had once been forgotten. The dust had not settled, but it had shifted. The land no longer echoed with the cries of the forgotten, but hummed with quiet renewal. Elara had become more than a figure on horseback, or a name on legal parchment. She had become a symbol of return, of rebuilding, of what happens when the world writes you off and you write your own chapter anyway. By spring, fences ran straight across her acres like stitched scars on healed skin. Orchards bloomed early. Calves were born strong. A schoolhouse, modest but dignified, was raised near the eastern hill, where a bell would soon ring for children who once knew only labor. That school bore no donor plaque, only a carved wooden sign that read, "Begin again." Elara never claimed to be mayor, preacher, or savior. She didn't need to. The town began to form around her not by order, but by gravity. People came not for charity, but for clarity. Widows, runaways, broken veterans, rejected daughters, they found space on her land because she gave no sermon. Only soil. And then came the town councilman from the capital. He arrived in a polished black carriage pulled by white horses that had never touched mud. He brought legal papers, maps, and offers that smelled of politics disguised as opportunity. The railway company wanted to expand, he said. They needed her land. Her approval, her silence. Ilara listened without flinching, and when he asked for her answer, she handed him an envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a single sentence: "Some things don't have a price." The next day, the councilman left in silence, his gloves dirtier than when he arrived. The rancher stood watching from his usual spot by the fence. He nodded once. He had been offered that same deal years ago and turned it down to DOT, and now standing beside a woman who had once been discarded, he saw not just resistance but redemption lived out loud. Later that month, the ranchers of Dry Creek gathered on the far ridge where her land and his met no longer a border, but a bond. A plan was unveiled to build a community granary, a clinic, and a market square. Not funded by one, built by all. The Maran, old cynical man who hadn't smiled since the last war, watched Ilara from the edge of the gathering, then removed his hat and whispered to a stranger, "If the land had a heartbeat, I reckon it'd sound like her." And then, one morning, long after the fire and the frost, another train came. Not carrying passengers, but delivering freight, tools, books, seed, ink, bricks, and people got off to new settlers, carpenters, teachers, midwives, musicians. One little girl with a straw doll looked up at Ilara as she passed and whispered, "Are you the lady who stayed behind?" Ilara smiled and said nothing, because some names were too small for what she had become. That night, the wind picked up across the plains, not harsh, not angry, but reverent, and it carried her name, not Ilara, the orphan, not the cast-off girl, but Ilara of Dry Creek, Ilara, who turned silence into legacy, Ilara whose redemption didn't come on a train. She built it with her own 2 hands, and the man who had once stepped off a train in silence now stood at her side, not as a rescuer, but as a witness. To what rises when you stop waiting for someone to save you and start saving the land beneath your feet.